Hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing well and having yourself a wonderful Friday. I have a new theater chat, or what are we calling them? Theater talk, with prepared for you guys today on a fresh subject that I thought would be kind of fun to dive into. Just to kind of review, for those of you who were perhaps not with us or haven't had a chance to see the first Theater Talk video, which is on our YouTube page. Last week I talked about Shakespeare, and Mr. Shakespeare, who's one of my favorite playwrights and one of my earliest introductions to theater was in high school. Being cast in the second play I ever got cast in was in Romeo and Juliet. And I was thinking about where to go today to continue our theater talks. And I was thinking about moving forward in history, because there's tons and tons of theater that has been created after the years of Shakespeare. And then I started doing some research, and I got inspired. I got inspired by doing some research. I know that sounds silly, but I was reading about the times of Shakespeare, and then when I was reading about it, some article referenced that in Europe, in all of Europe, before the days of Shakespeare. And really, Shakespeare's time in the, I guess you could say, the 1500s or so is when it really started to pick up, was the beginning of taking theater and theatrical events and putting them into a building and calling that building a theater. But right before that time, for a couple hundred years, there was a very, very cool trend going on in most of Europe, and especially in Italy and in France. Those are my terrible accents. And it was a different style of theater. And it's actually a style of theater that you are probably familiar with, even if you don't know the name of it. So today, I'm going to talk about the most popular style of theater right before Shakespeare's time in the 1400s. And the name of this type of theater has a really funny and very interesting Italian name, and it is called Commedia dell'arte. Okay, which basically Commedia dell'arte. Here, I'll put this so you can see it at the top of my notes here. That's how you spell it, right here, you guys. Yeah, Commedia dell'arte. Okay, so hey Sam, good to see you, my man. Today we're going to talk about Commedia dell'arte, the most popular form of theater directly before Shakespeare's times, and the most popular playwright in those days. Hey Robin, so good to see you. So glad that you are joining me this afternoon as well. This form of theater was very popular because it involved taking a troupe, a theater troupe, a whole group of people that were making theater together, and they would travel from town to town to town to town and make up plays, like kind of on the spot. And they were what were the kind of the birth of theater companies, okay, which is a term that we still use to this day. And they sort of had a revolving list of characters that they were all pretty familiar with, the character types, if you will, which I'm going to talk a lot more about that today. And they were really fun. You know, the Shakespeare stuff that I was talking about last week, while also really fun, sometimes the language is kind of dense and it's hard to really get into the story. And Commedia dell'arte is like the complete opposite of all of that. It is about a fast story, lots of characters, lots of plot twists, very overblown, dramatic acting choices, what I would call in my modern sensibility a bit melodramatic, if you will. But always the goal was to keep the audiences laughing and having a good time so that they could make a little bit of money in the new town. And then they would pack up all their stuff on a wagon, normally on a very, very big wagon that was pulled by a team of horses or mules or oxen. And then they would ride on their wagon as a whole theater troupe to the next town where they were booked to play for a couple of nights. And then they would set up in the town square and they would, you know, a lot of them, the reports go that the troupe would just show up in town and they would say, hey, who do you want to play this time? Who do you want to play this time? Oh, you got a good idea for that character this time? Okay. And then they would just sort of start to make up the story on the spot. So I am going to throw some facts at you guys today, but I'll try to keep it fun and interesting. And then I'm going to talk about how Commedia dell'arte has very much influenced all of television shows that we watch to this day. And then at the end of our little session today, I'm going to read you guys another little monologue. So I hope that you are strapped in and ready for some theater talk. Okay, here is a little history of Commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte is a form of improvisational theater that began in Italy, and it was popular for 2 centuries before Shakespeare's time, and still very popular to this day in that region, actually. The title, Commedia dell'arte, is difficult to translate into English, but a close translation would be Comedy of Craft, which I love that translation, you guys, because it is learning to be a good actor that can improvise and work on your feet is a very specific craft. And I like that translation. But another way you could refer to this is by its longer title, Commedia dell'arte al improvisio, which means a comedy of the creative ability of improvisation. A little bit longer, a little bit wordier, and I think that's why it's been shortened to Commedia dell'arte. Let's see. All right. I'm glad to hear that, Sam. Very glad to hear that, my man. All right. So the plays of Commedia dell'arte were often performed by a small group of traveling actors who performed in town squares, and the actors would pass the hat around for tips so that they would get paid and they would be able to eat and live off of that payment. And the words of these plays were mostly never written down. And it wasn't until the very later years of Commedia dell'arte's popularity that playwrights that wrote in the form of Commedia dell'arte often started to get more popular and actually write down these funny shows that they were making up on the spot. Some troupes were popular at foreign courts and invited to France regularly from Italy. And images of famous commedia stock characters became a favorite theme of the well-known French artists. So a lot of French artists would paint these very extravagant-looking characters because when you're performing in a town square, you've got to have some pretty awesome costumes. to grab people's attention. Not just good acting, but good costumes. And just like our school tour, they were performing in the daylight, so they didn't have staged lights or anything like that. And they very rarely even had a set. Maybe they would pull up the wagon behind them and have like one backdrop hanging over one edge of the wagon, and that would be it. I love it, Sam. I love it, man. Okay, so also important to remember, in Commedia dell'arte, actors often wore very large, exaggerated masks. And the stories were always melodramatic about characters, fighting for food or love or money. This style of theater birthed or created this term that we still use in theater to this day, which is stock characters. Examples of stock characters, these are all kind of Italian names. So I'm going to say these fun names, and then I'm going to actually explain what these characters actually were. So the stock character names that are very popular even to this day, the most popular one is Harlequin, which was a clown character, and very much where the name in the comic book franchise from DC that features Batman, the character Harley Quinn is kind of a nod to this old stock character from the 1400s. What? Yeah. Pantalone, Colombina, Pulcinella, Perot, and Scaramuccia, which is not just a lyric in the Bohemian Rhapsody, but it is actually a stock character from Commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte had a lot of influence on theater of its time, and really started to spread across all of Europe, and very much influenced the way that people saw theater directly before the popularity of William Shakespeare a little bit later. So I want to talk about these stock characters that are familiar to some of us, and will become more familiar to more of us. So in Commedia dell'arte, there are 4 sort of main stock types. And then within those 4 categories, there are many, many different variations underneath the main 4. But I'm going to just talk about the main 4 and then some of those variations today. So the first one is called zany. Okay. All right. I like that, Sam. I'm glad that you're ready for acting, and I really appreciate that you're going to try to stay awake in classes, because we really need your support and your enthusiasm. Okay, so the first type of these stock characters is called zany. It's spelled a little differently from the way that we spell it, but that's actually where we got the word zany, which is kind of crazy or whatever. But this is spelled Z-A-N-N-I instead of with a Y, because it's Italian. And the class or the type of characters that were considered zany characters were usually servants. Okay, so a lot of these plays were about the different class structure in Europe, and you've got your very wealthy people and your politicians and royalty, mostly up at the very top, and then you've got regular people who are maybe not super wealthy, but they're working class. You've got younger people, typically young lovers, and then you've got the poorer people and the people who are serving those higher classes, and those are the servants. Okay, and there are lots of different types of servants, and Harlequin was one of the most famous servants, who was a clown and a servant. And I'll get into all the different characteristics of Harlequin here in a moment. Okay, now we're moving on to the second category of stock characters. Okay. The second category is called the innamoratai. Innamoratai. And that category is the young lovers. And they typically also had music accompanying their sections of their plays. And so they would know some songs that they would sing together as well. And they were very, very popular in the times. A lot of reports actually say that most people really came out for the songs of the innamoratai. The young lover songs were just super popular in this era. Whatever gets them into the town square and gets that whole company being paid actors is all good with me. The third category of stock characters is called the Vecchi, Vecchi, and roughly translates to the old men, of which there were many different types of old men that were seen in these stock characters. They were typically had a little bit of money, and they were much more experienced in just the ways of life. And our fourth category, number 4, coming at you, is the capitani, which is close to a word that you should be familiar with, the captains. And these were typically military figures, and men and women. There was a il cap. Let's see. Blah, 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 one of the stock characters was called Il Capitano, if you were a man, and La Signora if you were a female captain. Okay, and they typically were the kind of the brunt of a lot of the jokes in the play, because they took themselves super seriously, but they were not really as heroic as they said that they were. So one more thing I want to share with you about the history of Commedia dell'arte is the word Lazzi. Not Yahtzee, not our fun rolling the dice game that we play at 7th Street, but Lazzi, spelled L-A-Z-Z-I. Okay, and Lazzi is they were basically, that translates to well rehearsed, and I really like that in the translation, well rehearsed physical jokes. And there was a lot of Lazzi that was going on. Okay. Oh man, Sam, you are just full of comments today, and I love it, my man. I can't wait to get back to doing what we all love doing, and making some theater together at 7th Street. I really appreciate that you are excited too as well, Sam. So Lazzi was well-rehearsed physical jokes, and really, you guys, was kind of the beginning of what we now know in modern times as slapstick comedy. Think of like the Three Stooges, throwing cream pies at each other's faces and bonking each other on the head and everything. Those were basically bits of Lazzi. So now I'm gonna move over to some different notes here and actually describe some of the characters' names, like Harlequin, and there are many others, and kind of tell you about some of their attributes that they would you would typically see in these characters. So the first one is there is a character who is also named after the category of servants, which are called zany. And this is the description for the zany characters, okay? Excuse me. The zany character was a buffoon or a clown, and known in those days as a simpleton, or an incompetent person. And the character was drawn from the lower classes of the time, normally peasants or migrant workers, and they were always servants or valets or porters, and sometimes just would handle any odd jobs around the house for the wealthy inhabitants of the house. The term zany refers to the classic mask that was often worn by these characters, and was a very important part of Commedia dell'arte, was wearing these big overblown masks. And the zany characters reflected the role of the peasants in everyday life, who were at the time were facing some really big struggles. There was lots of issues with getting regular food and getting regular money and those kinds of things. And so the audiences would often find themselves rooting for the servants. Okay, a lot more than the masters. All right, next up we have one of the most well-known characters, who was one of the types that was called vici, or old men. The old man character, known as Pantaloon, was a well-known Commedia dell'arte character. The original name for this character was Magnifico, and he always spoke in a very, very musical Venetian dialect. But that name pretty early on gave way to the word Pantaloon, and that became the name of that character. There are many, many different interpretations of this type of character. But the Pantaloon character is generally an old merchant, often wealthy and very highly esteemed in the community, and was always kind of down on his luck, and always had some really interesting business skills. And his mask was always highlighted with a big hooked nose and giant eyebrows, because he was older and wiser. Okay, so the Pantaloon character, one of the old men characters. Another character was Il Dottore, another one of the old man characters. Il Dottore is usually dressed in a medieval doctor's outfit, almost always seen in all black, with maybe a white ruff around the neck. And often Il Dottore would play parts that were similar to doctors, but also notaries or attorneys as well in these stories. And always would have a very, very large mask that would have very rosy cheeks and a bulbous nose. Okay. Il Dottore was a comic, very well-loved character, always very well-fed, so it was always a pretty plump character, and not only depicted physicians, but other prominent characters that you would run across in your community. All right, moving on to our next one, Harlequin, one of my favorites of the servant class, the zany category. And the Harlequin was one of the most popular masks worn in Commedia dell'arte times, and traditionally was cast as a bit of a dim-witted character, silly, simple-minded, always perpetually hungry. That's a big part of the Harlequin sort of drive. The character's always motivated by their hunger. And one of the youngest members of the cast would normally be cast as Harlequin. Harlequin would undertake errands for their master, pursue pretty young people around the town, and always get in all sorts of hijinks and all sorts of trouble. They would employ every technique they knew to pretend to be other people to serve the play, and was often absent from critical moments where people thought they would be, and very, very mindless, but legendary for showing up whenever the food was being served. I always thought that was kind of funny. Another one of the characters that I want to tell you about is Columbina. Columbina was usually cast as a very mischievous maid character, and comic, not always virtuous, and typically a best friend character, sometimes even a lover of the Harlequin character. And the costume was always what the maids wore in those times. Colorful patchwork, often set off by a white cuff. And Columbina translates loosely to little dove. And the masks would always be very dainty and very pure, almost white. And also would only typically cover the top portion of the actor's head, leaving the lower portion open so that they could eat and drink freely. Because just like Harlequin, Columbina loves to eat, okay? Because these servants don't get paid very much at all, if at all, and they're always hungry. And it turns out to be really, really funny stuff when you're always pursued by your, pursuing your objective through your stomach. Okay, so our next one is Il Capitino, or for the females, La Signora. And Il Capitino was a character of the Commedia dell'arte, normally very vain, so very wrapped up in their appearance, typically pretty deceitful, so they didn't always tell the truth, and they were always braggarts. So they were always trying to talk about all of these exploits, you know, and stuff like that, that they may not have actually done. And they were dressed always in bright and colorful military uniforms, because they're the captain or captainess. And they would always carry a big sword with several rust spots on it, or sometimes even cobwebs, trying to show the audience that even though they brag about being super brave and very heroic, that they very rarely actually use their sword. So I always thought that that was pretty funny. And finally, the last one that I want to share with you guys, there are many, many more of these names of these stock characters from Commedia dell'arte. And if you're interested, I highly recommend that you check out some on your own. But the last one I wanted to talk about today, because it leads me into the monologue that I'm going to read later on, is Perrault. And Perrault was a part of the servant class, the zanies, okay? But Perrault was a very, very unique kind of servant, and Perrault was often referred to, a loose translation would be the sad clown, okay? And a lot of the characteristics of Perrault was that they were a misanthrope. They kind of were fed up with humans and humanity's trifles, and that they had seen it all happen all before, and that the storylines were often very predictable to Perrault. And a lot of the audience members loved this character because sometimes they would see these troops, you know, come through their town week after week after week after week, and playing very similar characters and very similar stories, and having one character who's kind of winking to the audience like, man, haven't you seen this before, was really, really fun, and people thought it was very funny. So they were always making nods to the audience. So I wanted to talk about 2 plays, not 4 plays, 2 plays, Zach. 2 plays that I came in contact with when I was at Chico State, and then when I was in New York City. And my last play that I directed when I was at Chico State, it was actually right after I graduated from Chico State in 2008. and I got to co-direct a play that was written in this style. And the name of this play was, and I got to co-direct it with Joe Hilsey, who some of you might know from the Blue Room Theater. He's the artistic director at the Blue Room Theater and also acts in a lot of their productions and directs a lot of their productions. And Joe Hilsey kind of took me under his wing and let me be his co-director on this play called Scapino. And Scapino is a very, very famous piece of theater that has been written down, thank goodness, by one of the most famous playwrights of the time, right before Shakespeare, Mr. Molière. Okay, Molière was very, very famous playwright, and one of the plays that I first acted in when I was a freshman at Chico State was a Molière piece called Tartuffe, which is a really, really fun, bizarre character, and I got cast as one of the young lovers. But Scapino is all about a clown, all about a servant who is trying to serve his master, but he keeps getting distracted by his stomach. Yeah, kind of like a Harlequin type character. And I got to work with a wonderful local actor, Mr. Loki Miller, played Scapino in our production. And I just remember working all those comic bits of Lotzi, all of the physical slapstick comedy stuff, over and over and over and over again with Loki Miller and the rest of the cast. And it was so fun. And we got to perform it in the downtown plaza right after the plaza had been built. I think it was the first performances that summer of 2008. And I really got into this style. Okay, now jump ahead several years later, when I was living in New York City, after I went to graduate school, I heard about this play on Broadway that was just getting sold out every performance. And people were just saying, you got to go see this play. You got to go see this play. It's the funniest thing I've seen. And it was a new play that was based on an old Commedia dell'arte play, which is a very famous play called The Servant of Two Masters. And it was written by Carlo Goldoni. And The Servant of Two Masters kind of got revamped a little bit in England more recently in like 2013, 2014. And they rewrote it and retitled it One Man, Two Governors. And in British slang, governors is very similar to the word masters. Okay, so one man, two masters. And so this play, I waited and I waited and I tried my hardest, and I finally got a ticket to go see this play. And I had no idea who was in the play. And I got introduced to one of the most amazing actors I have ever seen live on stage. And this gentleman, the very next year, got his own television show. And a lot of people still didn't even know who this guy was. But he got that television show because of this production of One Man, Two Governors. And I still have the playbill from the Broadway play, One Man, Two Governors. And I waited outside the stage door, and I got several actors from the production to sign my playbill. And this signature, the black one right in the middle, that is all swirly and everything, is the signature of the lead actor, who is Mr. James Corden. And James Corden runs a late night show that comes on after the Colbert show. And he was the funniest actor I've ever seen live. I mean, it was like, the best way I can describe it, it was like I got to see Chris Farley or something like that on stage live. I mean, I was laughing so hard the entire time. And a lot of this play was very much straight ahead commedia dell'arte type stock characters, really funny hijinks. It almost felt like they were making up the play in front of me. The way that it was performed was so nonchalant and so very improvised, even though it had been written down previously. And so I wanted to just show you guys, if for any of you who are not familiar with James Corden, he is this guy right here. I'm going to try to get as close as I can. So yeah, there is my playbill, and there's my ticket. I even held on to my ticket from the time. Ooh, man, that was a steep ticket price. I had to pay $95 to go see that play. Broadway plays are not cheap, you guys. But I just wanted to share that that bit of fun with you guys, so that any of you who may already be fans of James Corden and not realize that he's a fantastic stage actor would be able to make that connection. So finally, I would like to leave you guys with a bit that I have always loved. So like I said, this style was very, very popular throughout Europe, but right before the decades right before Shakespeare became super popular in England. And William Shakespeare was definitely a student of history, and he was very familiar with the popular theater of the time, just before his. And he knew that people liked these types of characters. And so you often see a lot of stock characters from Commedia dell'arte kind of with their own spin in William Shakespeare plays. And because my favorite stock character is Perrault, the sad clown, I thought I would share with you guys a monologue from a character from one of my favorite Shakespeare plays that is a pretty famous monologue that comes from a character that I think is very much modeled after the Commedia dell'arte stock character Perrault, the sad clown. And it is the character of Jacques in the play As You Like It. And if you have not seen, there are many, many different film versions of As You Like It, but I highly, highly recommend this one. Okay? This is Kenneth Branagh, who's one of the best Shakespeare actors in all of England and the world, directed this production on film. I believe it was released in 2007. And one of my absolute favorite actors on the planet is in the cast, and that is Mr. Kevin Kline. And Mr. Kevin Kline plays the part of Jacques. And he performs this monologue that I'm going to read for you. One of the best performances I've ever seen of this monologue. But I'm going to share it with you guys today because this monologue is kind of William Shakespeare talking about all of the different stock characters that one plays throughout their lives. And you can definitely tell that William Shakespeare understood stock characters because of this monologue. And what happens in the story of As You Like It, right before Jacques delivers this monologue, is one of the other characters is basically saying, hey, don't stop fooling around and take this situation more seriously. And Jacques, who has seen it all, okay, just like Perrault, who finds this all very predictable and sort of responds in a very, very interesting way. So this is from the character Jacques from the William Shakespeare play, As You Like It. And it starts with one of the most famous lines from all of Shakespeare's plays, "All the world's a stage." And I'll read this for you guys now before I bid you adieu. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first, the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face, creeping like snail unwillingly to school, and then the lover, sighing like furnace with a woeful ballad made to his mistress's eyebrow. Then the soldier, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice, in fair round belly, with good capon lind, and eyes severe, and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part too. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon. With spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank and his big manly voice, turning again toward childish treble pipes and whistles in his nose. Last scene of all that ends this strange, eventful history is the second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. So, anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed our little chat about Commedia dell'arte, and oh, I love all these comments, Sam. Definitely, yeah. New York Broadway theaters are all closed right now, and that's because people are getting so sick in New York City that everything's shut down, just like out here. I got to meet James Corden, and I got him to sign my script after his wonderful performance. And that year, I believe was his Tony Award-winning performance for that character as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed a little bit more Shakespeare, even though we were talking about Commedia dell'arte, because that's one of the best monologues ever written in the history of theater, and it's all about the different characters that we play throughout the many stages of our lives. So I hope that you enjoyed Theater Talk this afternoon. Thank you for chiming in. And I hope that you all have a wonderful Friday and a spectacular weekend. And I will see you all again next week for more fun. Okay. Have a great afternoon, everybody.